Hey everybody. So I just finished watching the Democrat debate and just kind of wanted to give some quick thoughts here while it's kind of fresh in my mind. For those of you who don't know me, this is the Liberty Ambassador. You can check me out on YouTube. Uh, I actually just put up a new hot take video today on Pride Month. But let's get to the Democratic debate. So the main thing that kind of struck me in the debate was just how similar most of these candidates are and just really how far to the left they've all gone. I noticed that Castro was advocating for the repeal of a certain section of a bill which basically would call for the decriminalization of illegal immigrants. That would basically amount, as I understand it, to open borders. And you could tell that a lot of the other Democratic candidates didn't outright jump on board with that, though some of them did, but none of them directly refuted it either. None of them really seemed to be offended by the idea. Not to mention, we had things talked about like gun buybacks, universal health care was a common theme. There were some candidates that actually wanted to keep private insurance. There were some candidates, like Elizabeth Warren was one, that just wanted to scrap the whole system entirely, wanted to go basically full socialist on healthcare, which to me is insane because even a lot of these European nations that have so-called universal health care, most of them still have private health insurance. They may have the government paid for all of it or large portions of it, but they haven't completely scrapped private insurance. So the fact that Warren and some of the other candidates are willing to go that far is really, really crazy to me. And honestly, the only one who seemed to have any real sanity was John Delaney. I actually kind of liked his tagline. Basically, hey, I'm looking for real solutions here, not unrealistic promises. So, and even he, like, it's clear that he doesn't fundamentally disagree with them on a lot of these ideas. It's more just a case like, guys, we need to be realistic here. Another thing that I thought was interesting, how, and this isn't unique to a Democrat debate, Republicans do this too, but just how so many people just would not directly answer the freaking questions. They'd go on these long anecdotes and about like, I'm going to fight for these people. When I'm president, I'm going to do something about this. What is it? Not going to tell you that. Don't worry about it. But I'm going to do something about it. We're going to fight to do something about this. And I have to actually give Elizabeth Warren credit. I think she was one of the better ones at actually giving some degree of specifics as far as what she actually wanted to do when she was asked these questions. Another thing that got me is like these several Democratic candidates just kind of randomly speaking Spanish at certain parts. Like, you want to talk about virtue signaling? Really? Like, you're gonna take up half your time to say the same thing twice, once in a different language? I mean, look. Hispanic people aren't stupid, right? If you're a Hispanic person who can't speak English, they're going to be watching the debate. They're going to be watching it in Spanish anyway, at the very least with Spanish subtitles on. So come on, guys. Like, really? And then we even have one of the moderators asking a question in Spanish. It's virtue signaling. It's silly. Sure. What were some other key things that Tulsi Gabbard made what I thought was a really interesting comment, saying that we were no better off in Afghanistan today than we were before the war started. Well, Tulsi, I served in the Army too. I actually served in Afghanistan. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that things in Afghanistan are really the way that I would like them to be. But to say that it's no better than it was before we came in, I think that's just a ridiculous statement. Sure, the government that is currently there in Afghanistan is corrupt, and there's definitely problems for sure. But at least there's some degree of opportunity there that wasn't there before. And more importantly, when it comes to United States interests, is that Al-Qaeda does not currently have a safe haven in which to operate. That's the main reason why we went into Afghanistan. Now, to be fair, we do have people who seem to be trying to undo that by trying to negotiate with the Taliban. But nevertheless, at least for the moment, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups do not have a safe haven from which to operate. And that's the most important thing, that Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group didn't have a safe haven where they could just kind of chill out and bide their time and launch another 9/11. So you can have honest debates about whether we should still be there, about whether we need to pull out or not, but the idea that it's no better off than it was before we went on, to me, is just ridiculous. I also thought Mayor de Blasio was interesting, particularly when he invoked the NYPD police force. How he said he was in charge of the largest police force, I think, in the world was what he said. Well, the funny thing that he left out is he's not actually very popular with NYPD, and I know this because I've actually been working with the NYPD a lot lately. For my job, I've been doing wireless design for a lot of the precincts. And I've had a lot of discussions with various members of the NYPD, and I don't believe I've encountered a single one of them who has had positive things to say about de Blasio. And now, to be fair, the people I've spoke with don't necessarily encompass the entire NYPD. I haven't been to every precinct by any means. So it's possible that I just happened to, in the probably 20 or so precincts that I was at, I just happened to catch all of the people who didn't like de Blasio. That's a possibility. But it still, it does not seem to me from it seems very unlikely that de Blasio has any significant degree of support from the NYPD. So I think the idea that he's kind of touting them as a success story when they can't stand him and actually will, and oftentimes outright say that he makes the NYPD's job more difficult, is laughable. And most of the NYPD will tell you, and I think an independent observer kind of looking at the facts would tell you that while crime in New York City is at a better place than it had been a while back, I think most people would attribute that to the kind of remnants of Mayor Giuliani's policies. Most people will tell you, who I've spoken to about that in New York City, that it was kind of under Giuliani that things really got cleaned up. And I think it's more of a case that de Blasio has just managed to not screw it up bad enough so that there is a return to the pre-Giuliani era. So I thought that was interesting. As far as who I think maybe helped or hurt their chances tonight, I think Delaney, if he could ever make it to a general election, actually helped his chances tonight. But I don't think there's any way he'll ever make it out of the primaries. I still think I probably have pretty strong disagreements with him on a lot of things, but I think he proved himself far too reasonable for this left-wing Democratic primary. I think Warren, even though she was oddly kind of quiet during the last, I'd say, half hour of the debate. She didn't really get many opportunities to talk. I think she's probably looks the strongest out of the stage coming out of the debate. I want to say she was probably one of the best polling person in that group coming in as well. But I don't think she really hurt herself tonight. I think people kind of know who she is, as far as, she is, for better or worse, a very, very strong progressive. I call her a socialist, at least based on her healthcare policy. But so I think she's probably one of the stronger candidates. I feel like maybe Castro, by the fact that he kind of challenged other candidates on the immigration. I don't think he's ultimately going to be the nominee, but I think he might get bumped up a little bit. I don't think Beto's going anywhere. He's too vague. He dodged too many questions. And you know what? Maybe that somehow works, but I don't think someone who is genuinely interested in seeing progressive policies put in place, I think with all the other choices there, they're going to look at him and they're going to see through kind of the facade. Not to say that Beto, I don't think genuinely is progressive, but he's just, I feel like he's spouting a lot of rhetoric and there's not a lot of specifics. And I know if that had been someone on the Republican side talking about conservative policies, I wouldn't be thinking very highly of him right now. What else is really worth talking about kind of in the immediate aftermath of this? I'm going to take a look at my notes real quick. Oh, yeah. Speaking of Beto not directly answering questions, he was directly asked about how high he thought the highest individual income tax rate would be. He was asked specifically about 70%. And I noticed he took great pains to avoid directly answering that question. And I don't think anybody was actually forced to give a number for a tax rate that they would support on the highest earners, which I think is interesting because I think deep down they know that when you start talking about taking 70% of somebody's income, even when you're talking about the 1%, even when you're talking about a marginal tax rate, which is a portion of somebody's income, I don't think that flows well with most Americans. Most Americans do not like taxes, and I mean, I think Americans will probably support taxes on the rich if they don't believe it affects them. They may support that to some degree, but I think most of us still have enough kind of innate disdain for taxes. When you start talking about taking 70% of even a part of somebody's income, we just kind of recoil from that, I think, naturally. So I can see why Beto did everything possible to avoid answering that question. Another thing that struck me as interesting is kind of like the constant refrain about income inequality and how we need an economy that works for everyone. I'm sorry, but what is your data that there's large swaths of people that this economy is not working for in ways that are not their own fault? We have near, if not record low unemployment, pretty close to it. It's at least the lowest it's been in several decades, last I checked. That's a pretty good metric for how well we're doing. And this idea like, I think it was Tim Ryan who said, the bottom 60% of income earners haven't gotten a raise in several decades. Something people need to realize is that these percentages of income brackets, they don't stay the same. Like when people say, the top 1% of income earners, the people who make up that top 1% are not the same people over time. It's not the same people consistently in that top 1% bracket. People go into and out of that bracket all the time. The same thing with other income brackets. So this idea, there's a small group of people that are constantly in control of all the money is just factually not accurate. It's not true. And the fact that pretty much the entire Democratic field that was on the stage tonight seems to have bought into that lie is frankly very concerning. Another lie that got brought up tonight is the gender pay gap. I'm trying to remember because not all of them talked about it. I find it interesting that the women on the stage didn't talk about it very much, but it was the guys that mainly got the time on that. Let me see if I can find who actually got to talk about it. Actually, you know what? Tulsi Gabbard was asked about it, and she completely dodged that question. She pivoted to her military service. And, as a veteran, I appreciate her military service, but that's not what she was asked at all. And to be honest, I think that's purposeful because I think it may very well be that she knows that pay gap statistic is a myth. Because it is. Like the idea that men and women get paid different rates for the same work is it's factually inaccurate. It's not true. That statistic has been debunked time after time after time after time. When you account for legitimate reasons to pay people differently, such as different skill sets, years of experience, hours worked, those sorts of things, the pay gap basically disappears. So perhaps Gabbard knew that and therefore didn't want to talk about it, because if you go up on a Democratic stage and say the gender pay gap is a myth, you're probably done in those primaries, to be perfectly honest, which is a shame, because it would be a factually accurate thing to say, but it's not what left-wing voters want to hear. I don't really think they care about the truth that much, so much as they care about the narratives of things. Heck, speaking of that, you have, I want to say it was Cory Booker, who compared the number of black people who are incarcerated right now, compared it to slavery. He said, I believe he said that there are more people who are incarcerated, more black people who are in, he didn't use the term incarcerated, but it was he didn't use enslaved either, but it was some similar term than in 1850, which is probably technically true, because we've got a much higher population in general than we did in 1850. So it may very well be true that there are more black people in prison today than were enslaved in the United States in 1850. But that statistic really doesn't mean anything unless you correct for population. And I imagine that if you correct for population, it's not even anywhere near the same. And the fact that he doesn't understand that there's a vast, vast difference between being imprisoned for a crime and literally being treated as less than human. I would think that Senator Booker, as a black man, would understand the difference between being thrown in prison for something and literally being treated as less than a human being, not having your rights deprived by due process of law, but not even being recognized to have rights in the first place. There's a huge difference between those two things, and the fact that he conflated them really, to me, is insane. And that's not to say there aren't maybe good debates to be had about the effects that certain laws have on certain races versus others, like the drug war, for instance. I think those are important policy conversations to have, but that comparison is still just absolutely ridiculous. So that's really all I wanted to say about the Democratic debate right now. Myself and my Liberty Cadre companion, Zinga Johnson, are planning to actually do a discussion about it either tomorrow or within the next couple of days. So please look forward to that. We will have it up. We're probably going to record it and put it on the Liberty Cadre Facebook page and YouTube channel. We may decide to do it a different way if we can figure out something that's easier, but I think that's probably the way we're going to do it. So that's pretty much my immediate thoughts on the Democratic debate. Frankly, I hated that it was not fun to watch at all. It was kind of low, very, very, very light form of torture, to be honest. But that's my thoughts. Hope to talk to you again soon.